He stood just a few feet away, watching them humiliate his wife, and chose not to stop it. Not yet. Because some lessons needed to unfold completely before they could be understood. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Emily Carter. The first-class terminal at Skybridge International Airport gleamed under soft golden lighting, polished marble floors reflecting the steady stream of travelers in tailored suits and designer luggage rolling behind them. The air carried that quiet confidence reserved for those who never had to ask twice for access. And then there was Emily. She walked in without hesitation, her simple cream cardigan resting loosely over a plain white blouse, her jeans neat but unremarkable, her shoes comfortable rather than impressive. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention, yet somehow, it drew it anyway. Eyes lingered a second too long. A couple near the lounge entrance exchanged subtle glances. A man in a navy suit paused mid-step, his brow tightening just slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't belong. Emily didn't notice. Or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to care. Her pace was steady, her posture relaxed, her eyes calm as they moved across the signs until they found what she was looking for: first-class check-in. Behind the counter stood Jessica Miller, perfectly styled, her blonde hair pinned into a sleek bun, her uniform crisp enough to look untouched by time. She had mastered the art of the professional smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. And as Emily approached, that smile flickered, just for a second. A subtle pause. A quick glance downward. Shoes. Jeans. Cardigan. The mental checklist completed in less than a heartbeat. When Emily reached the counter, she offered a polite, almost warm smile. "Good morning." Jessica didn't return it. Not fully. "Boarding pass?" she asked, her tone neutral, but edged with something sharper beneath. Emily handed over her phone. Jessica took it, her fingers pausing for the briefest moment as her eyes scanned the name. Emily Carter. Her gaze lifted again, slower this time. Measuring, reassessing, and then dismissing. "I'm sorry," Jessica said, sliding the phone back across the counter without even scanning it. "This line is for first-class passengers only." The words hung in the air, quiet but deliberate. A man standing nearby shifted slightly, pretending not to listen. A woman across the rope divider leaned just enough to catch the exchange. The space between them tightened. Emily blinked once, not in confusion, but in recognition. She had heard that tone before, many times. Still, her voice remained soft. "Yes," she said gently. "That's where I'm checking in." Jessica's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something thinner. "Ma'am," she replied, this time a little louder, just enough for others to hear. First-class tickets start at around $3,000. This area is reserved for premium clients. A faint ripple moved through the small crowd. Not laughter. Not yet. But something close. Emily's fingers rested lightly on the counter. She didn't pull her phone back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step away. "I understand," she said quietly. "But I do belong here." Jessica exhaled slowly, her patience thinning, her posture straightening as if preparing to make an example. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," she said, her hand gesturing toward the general check-in area behind the velvet rope. "You're holding up the line." That was when the silence changed. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was anticipation, the kind that builds right before something breaks. Emily didn't move. Her eyes stayed steady, her voice calm, almost kind. "I believe," she said softly, "you're making a mistake." And somewhere behind her, just out of sight, a man in a tailored dark suit lowered his phone, his expression unreadable as he watched everything unfold. He had been there the entire time, and he hadn't said a word. Jessica held her posture, chin slightly raised, the faintest trace of impatience settling into her expression as if she had already decided how this moment would end. Around them, the quiet tension thickened, the kind that made people pretend not to look while watching everything. A man adjusted his cufflinks just to have an excuse to stay. A woman slowed her steps, her rolling suitcase barely moving as her eyes flicked between Emily and the counter. The velvet rope between first class and general boarding suddenly felt like more than a boundary. It felt like a line being drawn. Emily remained still, her hands relaxed, her breathing steady, her presence almost unnervingly calm in contrast to the subtle discomfort building around her. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, as if she had all the time in the world. Jessica noticed it, and it unsettled her more than any protest would have. "Ma'am," Jessica said again, this time her tone firmer, sharper, the polished politeness beginning to crack. "I need you to step aside now, so we can assist actual first-class passengers." The emphasis landed exactly where it was meant to. A quiet murmur followed, not loud enough to be called out, but enough to be felt. Emily's eyes did not waver. She tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet curiosity, as if she were studying something far more interesting than the words being thrown at her. "And how," she asked gently, "do you determine who qualifies?" The question lingered in the air longer than expected. Jessica blinked, just once, caught off guard by its simplicity. Then her expression tightened again, recovering quickly. "It is very clear," she replied, her voice carrying a controlled edge, "based on ticket class and verification, which you have not provided." Emily glanced down briefly at her phone still resting on the counter, untouched since it had been returned. "You did not scan it," she said softly. Another pause. This one sharper. A few heads turned more openly now. The man in the navy suit who had been watching earlier shifted his stance, his attention no longer hidden. Jessica's fingers tapped once against the counter, a small sign of irritation slipping through her otherwise composed exterior. "I do not need to scan it," she said, each word deliberate, "to know that you are not in the correct line." The sentence fell heavier than before. There it was. Not policy, not procedure. Judgment. Clear and unmistakable. Emily let out a slow breath, almost inaudible. For a brief second, her gaze moved past Jessica, across the lounge, taking in the polished floors, the glass walls, the quiet luxury that surrounded them. Then her eyes returned, steady as ever. "That is a strong assumption," she said. Jessica's lips pressed together, and this time, she did not bother hiding the irritation. "What is strong?" she replied, her voice rising just enough to draw full attention now. "Is expecting access to a space designed for people who have paid for a certain level of service." A couple near the entrance exchanged glances, the woman's expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. The energy in the room was no longer passive. It was leaning, waiting. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter, not in anger, but in quiet grounding. She leaned forward just a fraction, her voice still soft, still controlled. "And if I have?" The question cut through the space cleanly. Jessica froze for half a second, then gave a short, dismissive breath. "Then you would not be having this conversation," she said. A beat. Silence pressed in. And then, from behind the small gathering crowd, a voice spoke. Calm. Even. Unmistakably controlled. "That is where you are wrong." The sound did not need to be loud. It carried anyway. Heads turned almost in unison. The man in the tailored dark suit stepped forward, his movements measured, his presence shifting the atmosphere without effort. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. But with each step, the confidence around him settled into the room like gravity. He stopped beside Emily, his gaze moving from her to Jessica with quiet precision. "You should scan it," he said, his tone polite, almost casual. But there was something beneath it, something that made the air feel heavier. The room went still. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire terminal had forgotten how. Jessica's hand hovered just above the counter, her fingers frozen mid-motion, her eyes shifting from Emily to the man beside her. There was something about him that did not fit the usual rhythm of the place, not louder, not more dressed than anyone else, but quieter in a way that demanded attention. The kind of quiet that came from never needing to prove anything. His suit was tailored, but understated, his watch subtle, his posture relaxed yet precise. He did not look like someone trying to impress. He looked like someone accustomed to being recognized without trying. Jessica straightened, her professional smile snapping back into place, though it was tighter now, less certain. "Sir," she began, her tone carefully polite. "This is a restricted check-in area. I will be happy to assist you once I resolve this situation." He did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze dropped briefly to the phone still resting on the counter, then lifted back to her, steady and unreadable. "The situation," he said calmly, would resolve faster if you followed your own process. The words were simple, but they landed with weight. A few people shifted where they stood. The man in the navy suit lowered his gaze, suddenly very interested in his boarding pass. Jessica's smile faltered again, just slightly. "I assure you," she replied, her voice a fraction sharper now. "I am fully aware of our procedures." He nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "Then demonstrate it," he said. The air tightened. Emily stood beside him, silent, her expression unchanged, but there was a faint softness in her eyes now, as if she recognized something familiar in the moment. Not surprise, not relief, recognition. Jessica hesitated. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. Then, with a controlled breath, she reached for the phone. The scanner beeped softly as she passed it across the screen. 1 second. 2. The system processed. And then, her expression changed. It was subtle at first. A flicker. A pause. Then her posture shifted, her shoulders pulling back as if trying to recover ground she had just lost. Her eyes moved across the screen again, slower this time, rereading the information as if expecting it to correct itself. It did not. The name remained. The ticket class remained. First class. Confirmed. Paid in full. Not only valid, but upgraded beyond. Standard tier. Her fingers tightened slightly around the device. The silence around them deepened, no longer curious, but heavy. People were no longer pretending not to watch. They were watching openly now. Jessica cleared her throat, her voice returning, but thinner, less certain. "It appears," she said, choosing her words carefully, "there may have been a misunderstanding." Emily did not respond. She simply watched, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. The man beside her tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. Jessica nodded quickly, eager now, her tone shifting, trying to rebuild control. "Yes, of course. We see this sometimes with mobile boarding passes. It can be unclear at first glance." A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Not agreement. Something else. Recognition of the shift. The reversal. The man's gaze did not leave her. "Unclear," he said again, almost to himself. Then he looked at Emily for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them, before returning his attention to Jessica. "And yet," he continued, his voice still calm, still even, "you were very clear earlier." The words landed harder than anything said before. Jessica's lips parted, then closed again. No immediate response came. For the first time, she did not have one ready. The room felt smaller now, the polished space suddenly holding more weight than before. Emily reached for her phone, taking it back gently, her movements unhurried. She did not rush to move forward. She did not assert her place. She simply held it, as if waiting for something more than an apology. The man beside her stepped slightly closer to the counter, not aggressively, not confrontational, but enough to shift the balance completely. "Let me ask you something," he said quietly. Jessica looked up, her composure thinning at the edges. "Yes, sir." He paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch again. Then he spoke, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable. "If she had dressed differently, would you have scanned it first?" The question did not echo. It did not need to. It stayed exactly where it was, suspended in the air between them. And this time, Jessica had no answer at all. The silence did not break. It settled, heavy and undeniable, pressing into every polished surface of the terminal as Jessica stood there, her mouth slightly open, her usual confidence slipping through the cracks of a moment she could no longer control. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the small crowd that had now fully formed, no longer pretending to be distracted, no longer hiding their curiosity. They had seen the shift. They had heard the question. And now they were waiting to see how she would recover, if she even could. Jessica swallowed, her posture straightening as she forced a breath through her chest, trying to rebuild the authority she had worn so easily just minutes ago. "Sir," she began, her voice carefully measured, though the steadiness was no longer natural. "Our responsibility is to maintain the integrity of this space for all first-class passengers. We have to make quick judgments to ensure efficiency." The explanation sounded rehearsed even as she spoke it, as if she were reaching for something familiar in a moment that was anything but. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his gaze unwavering. He did not nod. He did not challenge her immediately. He simply let her finish, and in doing so, allowed the weakness in her words to reveal itself fully. Efficiency, he repeated softly, almost thoughtfully, as if testing the word itself. Then he leaned slightly closer to the counter, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic completely. At what cost? The question landed with precision, quiet but impossible to ignore. Jessica hesitated again, longer this time. Her eyes dropped briefly to the counter, then lifted, searching for something, anything that would restore control. "We treat all passengers with respect," she said, though the sentence felt thinner than before, lacking the certainty it once carried. A faint movement came from the side as one of the other attendants, a younger woman standing a few steps behind Jessica, shifted her weight uncomfortably, her eyes lowering as if she suddenly wished she were somewhere else. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the air around her now. Not power in the obvious sense, but something quieter, something earned. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded anything. And yet, everything around her had begun to adjust. The man beside her glanced at her again, just for a moment, and there was a faint softness in his expression, something almost protective, but controlled, measured. Then he turned back to Jessica. "Respect," he said, his tone calm, almost reflective, "is not something you declare after the fact." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything before them. A man near the entrance let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. The woman with the rolling suitcase lowered her eyes, her earlier curiosity replaced with quiet understanding. Jessica felt it. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete. The room was no longer on her side. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter, and for the first time, her voice softened, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. "If there has been any inconvenience," she said, carefully choosing each word, "I sincerely apologize." It was the correct sentence, the expected one, but it arrived too late to carry the weight it needed. Emily finally moved, just a small motion as she adjusted her grip on her phone, her eyes meeting Jessica's for the first time since the scan. There was no anger in them, no satisfaction, just clarity. "It was not an inconvenience," she said quietly. Jessica blinked, caught off guard again. It was a decision. The distinction settled in the space between them, undeniable. The man beside her nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the truth of it. Then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, he asked a question that shifted everything once more. "Jessica," he said, reading her name from the badge pinned neatly to her uniform. "How long have you worked here?" The use of her name caught her off guard, her posture stiffening slightly. "5 years," she replied, her voice quieter now. He nodded again, taking that in, as if it mattered. "5 years," he repeated. "That is long enough to understand what this place stands for." He paused, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle deeper. Then he continued, his tone still calm, still controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that made the air feel different. "So, I am curious," he said. "Who trained you to ignore your own process when it mattered most?" The question did not raise his voice. It did not accuse directly, but it exposed everything. And this time, the silence that followed was not just heavy. It was absolute. Jessica did not answer right away, and that silence told more than any explanation ever could. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, her mind racing for something that would restore balance, something that would make this moment smaller than it had already become. But there was no smaller version of what had just happened. Not anymore. The man watched her carefully, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet expectation, as if he already knew the answer and was simply giving her the chance to face it herself. Around them, the terminal remained still, the usual flow of movement slowed to a near standstill as people lingered, drawn into the gravity of a moment that had shifted from inconvenience to something far more revealing. Jessica finally inhaled, a controlled breath that trembled just slightly at the edges. "I was trained to prioritize efficiency and guest experience," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, though the words themselves felt fragile, as if they might collapse under their own weight. The man nodded once, acknowledging her effort without accepting it. Guest experience, he repeated, his tone almost reflective. That is an interesting phrase. He let the words settle before continuing, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. Tell me, Jessica, whose experience were you protecting just now? The question landed with quiet precision, cutting deeper than anything raised before. Jessica's eyes flickered again, this time not toward the crowd, but downward, toward the polished counter that now felt far less stable than it had moments ago. She could feel it, the realization forming, not all at once, but in fragments that refused to be ignored. She had not protected anything. She had chosen, and that choice was now standing in front of her. Emily remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her calm unbroken, but there was a quiet strength in the way she stood, as if she had long understood something that others were only beginning to see. She did not step forward. She did not speak again. She simply allowed the moment to unfold. The man shifted slightly, just enough to rest one hand lightly on the counter, his fingers relaxed, his tone still even, still controlled. You made a judgment, he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Before you verified, before you followed process, before you gave her the same respect you would have given someone else. Each word landed softly, but together they carried a weight that filled the entire space. Jessica closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, as if steadying herself against the truth of it. When she opened them again, the confidence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more honest. Yes, she said, barely above a whisper. The admission did not echo, but it changed everything. The room felt it. The tension shifted again, no longer waiting for confrontation, but witnessing understanding. The man nodded slowly, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. That is where it begins, he said. Then, for the first time, there was a subtle change in him, something almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The quiet observer was no longer just observing. He straightened slightly, his presence sharpening in a way that did not demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. Because this is not just about one passenger, he continued. It is about what you believe this place represents. Jessica looked up, her eyes meeting his fully now, and for the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty that went beyond the situation itself. It was not just about what had happened. It was about who he was. The question had not been spoken yet, but it was already there, forming in the minds of everyone watching. Who was this man who spoke with such calm certainty, who questioned without raising his voice, who carried authority without announcing it? The man did not rush to answer that unspoken question. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket with a smooth, unhurried motion, his eyes never leaving Jessica's. The small gesture drew every ounce of attention in the room. He placed a simple card on the counter between them. No flourish, no explanation, just a quiet, deliberate action. Jessica's gaze dropped to it, her breath catching as her eyes scanned the name printed there. And in that instant, everything changed. Jessica's fingers did not move at first, as if touching the card might make what she was seeing more real than she was ready for. Her eyes scanned the name once, then again, slower this time, each letter settling into place with a weight that pressed against her chest. Daniel Carter. The title beneath it was simple, almost understated, but unmistakable. Chief Executive Officer. Skybridge Airlines. The room did not erupt. It did not gasp. It did something far more powerful. It went completely still. The kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization. Jessica's breath caught, her posture shifting in a way she could not control, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if the ground beneath her had just changed. Her eyes lifted slowly from the card to the man standing in front of her, and for the first time, she did not see a passenger. She saw authority, not the loud kind, not the kind that demanded attention, the kind that simply existed, undeniable. Sir, she began, but the word faltered halfway through, no longer certain of its place. Daniel did not interrupt her. He did not rush to clarify. He simply allowed the moment to settle fully, his gaze steady, his expression calm, as if this outcome had never been in question. Around them, the subtle shifts began. The man in the navy suit straightened, his earlier indifference replaced with quiet awareness. The woman with the rolling suitcase stepped back slightly, giving space not out of obligation, but respect. Even the younger attendant behind Jessica stood a little straighter, her eyes wide, her understanding immediate. Emily remained beside Daniel, unchanged, her calm presence now reframed in the minds of everyone watching. Not as someone out of place, but as someone who had never been out of place at all. Jessica finally found her voice again, though it came softer, stripped of every layer it had carried before. I was not aware, she said, the words fragile, insufficient even as she spoke them. Daniel nodded once, not dismissing her, but not accepting the explanation either. That is exactly the point, he replied quietly. The sentence settled with precision. Jessica swallowed, her gaze dropping again, not to the card this time, but to the space between them, as if searching for a version of herself that had existed before this moment. I apologize, she said, more clearly now, though her voice remained low. To both of you. Emily looked at her for a moment, her expression thoughtful, not cold, not forgiving, simply present. Then she spoke, her voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. It is not about knowing who we are. Jessica looked up, her eyes meeting Emily's again, this time without assumption, without judgment, only listening. It is about how you treat someone when you think they are no one, Emily continued. The words were soft, but they carried through the entire space. No one moved. No one spoke. The truth of it did not need volume. Daniel glanced at Emily, a faint acknowledgement in his eyes, then returned his attention to Jessica. Your process exists for a reason, he said. Not just to protect the company, but to protect people from this exact moment. Jessica nodded slowly, the realization settling deeper, no longer something she could deflect or explain away. It was something she had to face. Daniel reached forward, taking the card back from the counter with the same calm motion he had placed it there. No dramatic gesture, no emphasis, just quiet closure. You have been here 5 years, he said, his tone steady. That means you understand what this brand stands for. Or at least you should. Jessica's lips pressed together as she nodded again, more firmly this time. Yes, sir. The title came naturally now, not forced, not practiced. Daniel studied her for a brief moment, not as a superior judging an employee, but as someone measuring understanding. Then he stepped back slightly, the tension in the room shifting once more, this time easing, but not disappearing. Then let this be the moment you remember, he said. The words were not a threat. They were something else, something quieter, something lasting, the kind of lesson that does not need to be repeated. The room remained silent. But this time, it was not heavy. It was clear. And in that clarity, everything had changed. For a few seconds, no one spoke, as if the entire terminal had collectively decided that this moment deserved to remain untouched, unbroken. Then, slowly, movement returned. Not abruptly, not carelessly, but with a new awareness that lingered in every step, every glance, every quiet breath. Jessica stood straighter now, but it was no longer the rigid posture of authority. It was something more grounded, more deliberate, as if she understood that standing tall meant something different than it had just minutes ago. She reached forward again, this time with steady hands, her voice composed but changed. Ms. Carter, she said, her tone respectful, measured. Please allow me to complete your check-in properly. Emily looked at her for a moment, not searching for perfection, not expecting it, but recognizing the effort. She gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to acknowledge the shift. Jessica scanned the boarding pass again, this time following every step, every protocol, her attention precise, her movements careful. The system confirmed what had already been clear, but now it was not about proving anything. It was about doing it right. Your seat has been confirmed in first class, Jessica continued, her voice steady. And you also have access to the Skybridge Premium Lounge. Boarding will begin in approximately 40 minutes. The words sounded the same as they would have before, but they carried a different weight now, shaped by everything that had just happened. Emily accepted the printed pass, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge, her expression calm. Thank you, she said simply. No trace of resentment. No need to revisit what had already been understood. Daniel stood beside her, observing quietly, his presence no longer pressing, but still undeniable. He did not intervene. He did not add anything. He allowed the moment to complete itself. The people who had gathered began to shift again, this time with purpose, their attention slowly returning to their own journeys, but not entirely unchanged. A man who had been watching adjusted his jacket, his expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering something beyond the situation itself. The woman with the rolling suitcase moved forward, but her earlier curiosity had softened into something quieter, something reflective. Even the younger attendant behind the counter stepped forward slightly, her posture more attentive now, her understanding deeper than it had been before. Jessica finished the final steps of the check-in, then paused, just for a brief second, before speaking again. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice lower, more personal this time. "I appreciate your patience." Emily met her eyes, and for the first time, there was a faint warmth there, subtle but present. "Patience," she replied softly, "is easier when you know who you are." The sentence settled gently, without weight, without pressure, but it stayed. Jessica nodded slowly, taking it in, not as a correction, but as something to carry forward. Daniel glanced at Emily, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, then shifted his attention back to the space around them. The terminal had returned to its rhythm, but something in the air remained different, as if the place itself had absorbed the lesson. He took a step back, giving Emily space, not out of distance, but out of respect for her presence, her strength, the way she had handled everything without ever needing him to step in. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her movements unhurried, her posture steady. She turned slightly toward the lounge entrance, then paused for a moment, her gaze drifting briefly across the counter one last time. Not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge the change that had taken place. Then she continued. Forward, her steps quiet against the marble floor, her presence no longer questioned, no longer measured, simply understood. Daniel followed a moment later, his pace matching hers, neither ahead nor behind, just beside. And as they walked away, the space they left behind did not return to what it had been. Because sometimes, the loudest impact is not made by a raised voice or a dramatic gesture, but by a quiet moment that forces everyone to see what they missed the first time. And that day, in a place built on status and perception, something far more important had been revealed, not through power, but through how it was used. The lounge doors closed softly behind them, muting the distant hum of the terminal, but not the weight of what had just unfolded. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately, quieter, more refined, the low murmur of conversation blending with the soft clink of glass and the subtle glow of warm lighting reflecting off polished surfaces. Emily stepped in first, her pace unchanged, her presence still calm, still grounded, as if nothing about the outside scene had disturbed her rhythm. Daniel followed just behind, his eyes scanning the room briefly, not with suspicion, but with awareness, as if measuring whether this space lived up to the standard it claimed. A hostess near the entrance straightened instantly upon seeing them, her expression polite, but this time without hesitation. "Welcome," she said, her tone genuine, her posture respectful. Emily offered a small nod, returning the greeting with quiet ease. There was no need for explanation, no need for validation. The system already knew who she was. But more importantly, the room now understood how it should respond. They moved deeper into the lounge, passing rows of leather chairs, sleek marble tables, and travelers who glanced up just briefly before returning to their own worlds. Yet something was different in those glances now. Not judgment, not curiosity, recognition, not of identity, but of presence. Emily chose a seat near the window, where the runway stretched out in long silver lines beneath the afternoon light. Planes moved slowly in the distance, their engines humming softly, each one carrying its own story, its own destinations, its own quiet moments of transition. She sat down, setting her bag beside her, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Daniel remained standing for a moment, his gaze still on her, not questioning, not concerned, but thoughtful. "You handled that the way you always do," he said finally, his voice low, steady. Emily glanced up at him, a faint smile touching her lips, subtle but real. "The way I always have to," she replied. The words were not heavy, but they carried truth. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding more than he needed to say. He took the seat across from her, leaning back slightly, his posture easing now that the moment had passed. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was familiar, comfortable, the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. A server approached, her movements smooth, her expression warm. "May I offer you something to drink?" she asked politely. Emily looked at her, her eyes soft, her tone just as gentle. "Just water, thank you." Daniel nodded in agreement. The server smiled and stepped away, her professionalism intact, but now grounded in something more genuine. Not performance. Respect. Emily's gaze drifted back to the window, her eyes following the slow movement of a plane preparing for departure. For a moment, she seemed distant, not physically, but thoughtfully, as if revisiting something deeper than what had just happened. "It never really changes," she said quietly. Daniel did not ask what she meant. He already knew. "No," he replied, his voice calm. "But how you respond to it does." Emily exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I used to think it was about proving something," she continued. "About showing people they were wrong." Daniel watched her closely, listening, not interrupting. "But it is not," she said after a brief pause. "It is about not letting them decide who you are." The words settled between them, quiet but powerful. Daniel leaned forward just slightly, resting his hands together, his expression thoughtful. "And today?" he asked. Emily turned her head, meeting his gaze. Again, her eyes steady. "Today was not about me," she said. "It was about them." Daniel considered that, then nodded slowly, a faint understanding settling in his expression. Around them, the lounge continued its quiet rhythm, but something about the space felt more aligned now, as if the lesson from outside had carried through the doors and into every interaction that followed. The server returned with their drinks, placing them gently on the table, her smile genuine, her tone warm. "Please let me know if you need anything else." Emily nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you." The server stepped away, and for a moment, everything felt still again. Not tense, not uncertain, just clear. Outside, a plane lifted from the runway, its ascent smooth, effortless, disappearing into the open sky. And inside, in a place defined by status and access, something far more meaningful had taken root, not through titles or power, but through a simple truth that no one in that terminal would forget. The way you treat someone when you think they have nothing reveals everything. The announcement came softly over the speakers, a calm, measured voice cutting through the quiet rhythm of the lounge. First-class passengers for Flight 278 to New York are now invited to board. The words carried no urgency, yet they shifted the atmosphere instantly, like a gentle signal that the next chapter had already begun. Emily lifted her gaze from the window, her eyes steady as she absorbed the moment, not rushing, not reacting, simply acknowledging. Daniel stood first, adjusting his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion, then glanced toward her, not as someone leading, but as someone walking beside. Emily rose just as calmly, reaching for her bag, her movements unhurried, her presence unchanged despite everything that had taken place. They walked together toward the boarding gate, their steps quiet against the polished floor, blending seamlessly into the flow of travelers who now moved with a different kind of awareness. As they approached the gate, the same space where everything had unfolded just moments before, there was no crowd waiting, no lingering tension, only a subtle shift in how the space held itself. Jessica stood behind the counter again, but she was different now. Not in uniform, not in posture alone, but in the way she looked up when Emily approached. There was no hesitation this time, no scanning of appearance, no silent judgment, only clarity. "Welcome, Miss Carter," she said, her voice calm, respectful, genuine. Emily met her gaze, her expression soft, not triumphant, not distant, simply present. She handed over her boarding pass without a word. Jessica scanned it, her movements precise, her attention complete. "You are all set," she said, her tone steady. Then she paused, just briefly, before adding, "Have a wonderful flight." The words were simple, but they carried meaning now. Not as a script, as a choice. Emily nodded slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice just as gentle as before. No more, no less. Daniel followed, his presence still quiet, still controlled, but no longer unnoticed. Jessica glanced at him, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with understanding. He did not speak. He did not need to. The moment had already said everything. They walked down the jet bridge, the narrow corridor stretching ahead, the hum of the aircraft growing closer with each step. Inside, the cabin greeted them with soft lighting, wide seats, and the quiet professionalism of a crew that now moved with careful attention, each gesture deliberate, each interaction grounded in awareness. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile, one that did not waver. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone genuine. Emily returned the smile, taking her seat by the window once again, her view now framed by the curve of the aircraft instead of the lounge glass. Daniel settled beside her, his posture relaxed, his presence steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the aircraft for departure. Inside, the cabin remained calm, a quiet space suspended between where they had been and where they were going. Emily rested her hand lightly on the armrest, her gaze drifting toward the wing as it caught the fading light. Daniel glanced at her, a faint smile touching his expression. "You know," he said, softly, "most people would have handled that very differently." Emily did not look away from the window. "Most people are trying to prove something," she replied. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering her words. "And you are not?" he asked. Emily finally turned her head, her eyes meeting his, calm, clear, certain. "I already know who I am," she said. The answer was simple, but it settled deeper than anything else that had been said that day. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began to move, the slow roll toward the runway marking the quiet beginning of something new. Outside, the airport stretched out beneath them, a place filled with movement, decisions, moments that passed quickly.